Thanks very much. We move on now to, last but not least, Jeff Patmore, who was previously Head of Strategic University Research and Collaboration at British Telecom. Again, one of Britain's really intensive users of university research, including in the social sciences. And Jeff has got a wonderful blog which is on the impact of social sciences blog, if any of you want to get to see that. But he's going to give us the gist of this in just 5 minutes.
Absolutely. Right. So, hello. So a couple of admissions, first of all. First of all, I'm an engineer. Okay, let's just be upfront about that. The other admission, and this is a bigger one, is as engineers we like to build things. So in my area, in British Telecom, I used to construct business systems, quite large business systems. And probably a lot of you, along with about 18 million others, are users of one of my business systems that I deployed in 2002. Because I was responsible, here's the admission, for broadband. I deployed direct access broadband for British Telecom. I was responsible for the development of all the systems behind it, everything from catching the original request for it through to all the supply chains that sit behind it, and of course finally billing people for it, all the business systems that sit behind that. So two admissions: A, I'm an engineer, and B, I deployed broadband. But the interesting thing was, that's when I moved into research, because I found that some interesting things were happening as a result of providing the UK with broadband, and perhaps I should know a bit more about these. And at that time, I moved across into starting to manage what you've seen as this Strategic University Research Programme for British Telecom. To give you some context, I retired from British Telecom 2.5 years ago, and the University of Cambridge invited me to join them. So I've spent the last 2.5 years in academia, which gives me a nice sort of perspective to look back on what I did for 10 years running research for British Telecom. I was introduced fairly soon after starting the university research programme to some social scientists. I hadn't really met social scientists before then. I'd been in engineering. I have to admit, I had one social scientist working for me. I had a team of about 200 people. There was one social scientist in BT, a social anthropologist. And she did nudge me in the right direction every now and again about user interface design and that sort of thing. But I hadn't really interacted with social scientists. So when I took over the university programme, I started to interact with social scientists. I found it incredibly interesting. Some of my colleagues found it strange. For instance, I met with some psychologists and some social anthropologists and some economists. You know, and that all seemed fairly straightforward. When I met with some philosophers, they began to wonder if I'd lost the plot. But what I started to understand was that how people, of course, use the systems that British Telecom were deploying was incredibly important. And there's a couple of my colleagues are sitting in the audience, and they would say, of course, that understanding the end user and actually putting the user at the centre of our system design was absolutely crucial. And I started to understand that. I had what you might describe as an epiphany. I began to see what the social scientists could offer me. I worked with a young social anthropologist who wanted for her PhD studies to understand the impact of broadband. This was wonderful. And she taught me a lot about the way in which social anthropologists work. And they go and spend lots of time with people, sometimes tribes in jungles, but in our case, users of broadband. But that, of course, taught me a tremendous amount about what people need. And also I learned the difference between wants and needs, by the way. And those of you, of course, in the social sciences will, of course, understand the difference between wants and needs. I had no idea. And certainly I might have asked people what they wanted, and of course I would have got a wish list. So to understand by studying people and filming people and standing behind pieces of glass so that you couldn't be seen watching people, these are things I had no understanding of perhaps 12 years ago. British Telecom, and thank you for saying, does actually interact now extensively with the social science because it's really important that we understand the impact of technology. Fairly recently we ran a study where we looked at, because we'd been asked to, what is the actual impact of modern communications technology on people, on children, on families, on adults? And we looked at it not only in the UK, but we looked at it across a number of countries. We looked at it in America, in the UK, in Australia and in China. And the findings were incredibly interesting, and of course the cultural differences came in. In fact, as you would obviously guess, some of the cultural influences in China mean that the use of technology is actually different. I'm pleased to say the BBC did a super piece on it for us. And
wasn't for you.
But then we come back to this impact. So how did we make sure that there was impact associated with? Let's just take that piece of work that we did on looking at the way in which people use communications technology today. We worked with a very good PR team who worked with people like the BBC and many others. We ended up with over 200 pieces of media coverage for the research. The BBC kindly gave us about a 7-minute slot on breakfast TV and news at 6. Column inches are really important. These days it's column centimetres, but the press coverage you get, there was BT doing some interesting work in this area, looking at how people are using communications. Are people feeling overwhelmed by it? Was an interesting question. Do you get too many emails? Are you being overwhelmed? All of that had real impact within the company. Think about how we can mediate some of those issues that do come up. And of course the press coverage does the company no harm whatsoever. It has real value and impact. So British Telecom does a lot of work with social scientists. Of course we do a lot of work with engineering people as well. But the key is we work together with multidisciplinary teams which involve the social sciences and the STEM areas as well. One last thing I'd like to perhaps trigger the conversation. The reason that British Telecom has very, very long relationships with academic institutions is we understand that if all we did was mine the information and took it away, we wouldn't have partnerships for very long. We do try and understand what the academics and the students want to get out of the relationship, and if it's publishing papers or getting involved in interesting pieces of research, then we make sure that happens, because a partnership has to be a partnership, and everybody has to gain value from it. And I think within British Telecom, that's very well understood. There must be value for both sides, and if we can get that to happen, then we have long, sustainable relationships.
Thanks very much, Jeff.